and the missionaries began to publish in scholarly journals, such as the Archiv für Religionswissenschaft, or in other journals like Anthropos, and therefore their knowledge circulated in the scholarly field. To be short, missionaries established a worldwide net and at the same time began to become part of other networks connecting different worlds and expertise. And I think one cannot really overestimate their impact as these kind of global players. We already have some studies on which kind of knowledge these missionaries produced and which kind of knowledge was distributed in these global networks. There are studies, for instance, from Patrick Harris. He worked on Swiss missionaries in South Africa. Missionaries, they spent most of their time in South Africa with hunting butterflies, categorizing insects, and writing articles about many until then unknown species. There is studies of Ronald Inden, for instance, who emphasized the impact Jesuits had on the establishment of Chinese linguistics. And there is the work of David Livingstone, who worked on the Chinese linguistics, and Ronald Inden pointed out to the influence of missionaries in the so-called Oriental disciplines such as Indian or Asian studies. That means we know already a lot about what the missionaries contributed to these academic new disciplines. However, without denying the importance of the missionary contribution to this scholarly knowledge, I want to argue there's more to be discovered. Instead of focusing on what missionaries did beyond, and even perhaps despite of their daily work of bringing the gospel, because they were also interested in botany, geography, or zoological studies, I will have a closer look at the heart of their day-to-day work, at the bringing of the gospel, and argue that it was also out of this core work that they enriched our knowledge, and that we have to look at this work in order to really get an idea what else they contribute to our knowledge. By drawing my attention to the, at first glance, exclusively religious everyday work of missionaries, their bringing of the gospel, I want to argue that studies interested in knowledge production should not fall into the trap of assuming that religion-making and knowledge-making are mutually exclusive. The contrary is true. Bringing the gospel, and I would like to add, religious making and knowledge making go hand in hand. The daily missionary routine of observing, for instance, so-called fetish rituals, or studying the supposedly magical meaning of a mask or hidden aspects of circumcision rites, were not only necessary preconditions for a successful conversion work. Out of these observations emerged a whole new world of religious knowledge, which then was classified in the new taxonomies of religion and mission studies. I will now have a closer look at this day-to-day work of the missionaries and try to show how out of this work what kind of knowledge emerged. If you look what the missionaries did day for day, one has to just get into the sources and, for instance, read the sources of the Catholic Steyler missionaries, which have been in Togo. Togo is my special field of interest. And if you look in the sources of the Catholic Steyler missionaries in Togo, you can see that 5 times a week they had to preach and preaching and reading and doing catechisms. Then they had 5 times a week school teaching with special emphasis on the Bible and on singing hymns, and 1 hour per day, so-called religious conversations. Other reports paint a very similar picture. Missionaries spent most of their time with bringing the gospel and teaching. This is normal, nobody would expect anything else. However, fulfilling this primary and everything but easy task of bringing the gospel in Africa or in China or in Japan depended on at least 2 prerequisites important for my argument. In order to be able to bring the gospel, one has to have a basic knowledge of the local language. That's easy to understand. Nobody would listen to you if you speak German or whatever, because nobody understands, so you have to learn the language. And second, you have to have a precise idea of the mindscape of the so-called heathen. If you want to reach them, you have to have an idea of what the mindset of these heathen is. Learning this language, to begin with this first precondition, was a very complex process. It always is a complex process, but it was at that time a very complex process because nobody knew the African dialects, nobody knew the Japanese, nobody knew the Chinese, nobody knew these languages in Europe, or almost nobody knew it. And therefore, it was a very complex process, and an interaction between different peoples over a long period was needed. All missionary reports emphasized the difficulties and the enormous amount of time needed for learning the language. But they finally succeeded in and wrote grammars, dictionaries, and linguistic articles in scholarly journals and hundreds of books about these different languages, and therefore helped emerging what nowadays is called linguistics. This is at the heart of their work. Trying to understand the mindset of the so-called heathen, that means the ideas they have, is a second precondition of bringing the gospel. And this was not less time-consuming. The Presbyterian missionary John Getty, for example, who had come to the Pacific Islands in the midst of the 19th century, keenly interested in understanding the islanders, needed dozens of encounters, close observations, and a lot of reading to recognize that, and I quote from him, religion and its enactments of faith were woven into practices of daily life. His understanding of local religious ideas grew by dozens of everyday encounters with people explaining him why which the divine force were at work in which particular place, and how to recognize the different types of so-called fetish priests. And what they then learned by trying to understand these rituals was something they also wrote articles about, and they published in the emerging anthropological journals or in the mission study journals, or wrote entirely scholarly books. Important for my argument is that this daily work of learning the language and of studying the local life, the basic prerequisites of bringing the gospel, already can be understood as a means of producing knowledge. Because translation, as well as description, are basic hermeneutic activities. Each translation of the even names, even the language which was spoken at Togo, attributed to what, for instance, the missionary Jakob Spiel understood as a representation of God, and hence new cosmologies. Each description of a given ritual published in the Catholic journal like Anthropos, or in proper books, already is an ordering, a naming, a framing, and at the same time a silencing and an expulsing of meaning, whether this description is published in a scholarly journal or not. but not only translating Christian texts into local languages and describing local rituals, techniques which at the same time produced knowledge, crucial for mission and scholarly studies, were important preconditions for bringing the gospel. A third kind of knowledge has to be mentioned. A third kind of knowledge was located also in this daily conversion work of the missionaries. And I there always come back to the young missionary Bernhard Schlegel, which I mentioned at the beginning, who described some so-called fetishes. This is as well something another missionary called a fetish. Schlegel, as most missionaries, attributed central importance to the collecting, describing, and, this is another topic, destroying of the so-called fetishes. Many missionaries were almost obsessed with these objects, which were understood as most obvious signs of heathen power and still lasting influence of heathenism, and therefore a stigma of missionary failure in bringing the gospel. Their observations they made with these objects we now have in the museums, written down in articles, sometimes even books, played such an important role in the missionary daily work because they hoped that a precise analysis of this most obvious signs of non-Christian belief system and of the non-Christian practices going hand in hand with these objects would allow them a better access to the everything but easy to understand mindset of the locals. And therefore they collected and described these objects. But missionaries not only described these objects, they also collected them and brought them to Europe or the Americas. And for instance, the missionary Nassau sent ethnological samples to the Princeton's National History Museum. German missionaries sent their objects to one of the Berlin museums. And once placed in an anthropological museum, the so-called fetishes were highly appreciated as ethnological objects, serving as information source for all questions at stake in the new discipline of anthropology. Anthropologists were very interested in these objects because they thought that analyzing these objects would tell them something about the local population. They hoped, or that they thought, the anthropologists, that these objects would offer more objective information to be read like specimen in the natural sciences. Even more, as Andrew Zimmerman has shown, many contemporary scholars thought that true anthropological knowledge could only be acquired by studying objects as these, classifying them and putting them in a non-narrative system. And it was the missionaries who brought these objects and who brought the explanations. To be short, the most time-consuming daily routines of teaching and preaching the gospel, which relied on a basic understanding of local languages, local rituals, and the meaning of the so-called fetishes. And fetishes, everything was called fetish. Everything what was not understood and what was thought have some symbolic or religious meaning.